Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these heterodox conversations for complexity. Okay, so for those who are longtime listeners, you will certainly have recognized a much different intro, and I'm very excited to announce that we're going to be making some changes around Teach Thought PD. Teach Thought PD will formally be renaming and rebranding to Thought Stretchers Education, and the Teach Thought podcast will now be the Thought Stretchers podcast. I'll definitely continue with many of the same conversations that you are familiar with, but I also want to focus on increasing our footprint in the heterodox space for K-12 in ways that are meant to help educators navigate these choppy waters more successfully. All of our professional development offerings will still remain and will be found at wegrowteachers.com, but we're also going to be launching a community called Thought Stretchers Community. More details to come on that. But again, that is meant to give a space for those stakeholders in the K-12 space to think more deeply with complexity and nuance about some of the more controversial or divisive issues from culture war to pedagogy and everything in between. We'll have many more details in the coming weeks on the website as we shift over and make this change, but we're very excited about this change in direction and the future that it holds. In this episode, I spoke with Gregg Behr and Rydzewski. They are the co-authors of a book called When You Wonder, You're Learning, Mr. Rogers' Enduring Lessons for Raising Creative, Curious, Caring Kids. As you might imagine, we talked a lot about wonder and inquiry and curiosity, and some of those tensions that I often talk about with scaffolding and assessment and good teaching and learning and keeping kids on a particular academic cognitive path, and how that sometimes butts up against curiosity and wonder as an ideal in a classroom. We talked about connections and the importance of those kinds of connections and things like deep listening and loving speech and the importance of having curious conversations in ways that allow for a variety of viewpoints, something that certainly resonates with us here and this podcast and our work. As always, I hope you find it helpful. I am here with Gregg Behr and Rydzewski, and they are going to introduce themselves, and we're going to talk about, among other things, a book that they have co-authored. It's called When You Wonder, You're Learning, Mr. Rogers' Enduring Lessons for Raising Creative, Curious, Caring Kids. So, I don't know who wants to go first. They're in the same room, so they can jab each other with elbows and figure out who wants to go first. But why don't you give our listeners a little background on who you are and why you came to write this book together?
So I guess I'll go first. This is Ryan, since I'm standing closest to the mic. So my name is Rydzewski. I am a former teacher. So I taught 4th and 5th grade for several years. I was also an educator coach before going back to school for writing. And actually, so Gregg and I began working together almost a decade ago on various communications pieces. We both work in the education philanthropy space now. And it was about 5 years ago when we really started digging into the learning sciences. And we live in Pittsburgh, which is the home of Mr. Rogers. And as we were meeting scientists from places like Carnegie Mellon University and University of Pittsburgh, but also places beyond, we realized that when people talk about learning and learning science, they weren't talking in ways that sounded so scientific. You know, we expected a lot of nuts and bolts and graphs and charts and things like that. But really, they were talking about, how do we make sure kids feel safe? How do we make sure that they belong to a community that cares about them? They sounded, we like to say, as like script writers in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. And that was the sort of genesis for our book.
Okay. Hi, Drew. I'll add a layer to what Ryan said. This is Gregg. That we're both kids of Western Pennsylvania. And that's important because Mr. Rogers was born in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, just to the east of Pittsburgh. He recorded that iconic television program, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, right here at WQED Television, America's first public television station. And for a couple of decades now, across southwestern Pennsylvania, this neighborhood that Mr. Rogers himself called home, there have been teachers and librarians and museum exhibit designers and other caring adults who work in the learning space who've been trying to figure out, what do kids today need? How do we support innovative, wondrous, joyful learning environments in and out of school, early childhood through higher education? We call this network, of which all of these folks are part, called Remake Learning. There are thousands of educators in and out of school that are part of this. And in so many ways, and yet in their own way, they're very Fred-like. And so our book also springs forth from this neighborhood, this place that calls Mr. Rogers home, where his DNA, his blueprints for learning are embedded in the work that educators across this corner of the world implement every single day.
So your involvement with, and maybe it's helpful to give a little background on your specific involvement with Mr. Rogers and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and that work. Could talk about it in the book a little bit, but can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, this is Gregg. I had the pleasure of knowing Mr. Rogers, right? And I met him as an adult. So you could imagine that moment as an adult meeting a childhood hero. What I really came to know, though, in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was his wife. Joanne Rogers was a friend and colleague for the last 2 decades of her life. In fact, Joanne wrote the foreword to our book. It's one of the last things she probably ever did here on planet Earth. And Ryan and I, in the course of working with schools, museums, libraries, and others across the Pittsburgh region, we've also had a chance to work over the years with Fred Rogers Productions. The Fred Rogers Company today is actually the largest producer of children's multimedia once again for PBS and in the children's media landscape. And there are so many people still that work with the company that were part of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So we've gotten to know, through the work of the company, through the Fred Rogers Institute, which is an academic institute based at St. Vincent College, we've gotten to know the neighborhood of people that, along with Fred, helped create the neighborhood. So we're deeply connected to Fred and his legacy and the people that were part of the neighborhood.
Okay, and the name of the book, of course, is When You Wonder You're Learning. That seems to lean pretty heavily into one of the things that we talk a lot about with teachers and work with them on, which is inquiry. And I think the sort of subtitle of that chapter 1, which is When You Wonder You're Learning, but then curiosity. So you've got curiosity, creativity, communication, working together, learning and growing, and connection. I certainly can make a pitch for it, and have and do quite often, but I'm curious why, and maybe rooting it, because that's the point of the book here, I think, is to basically pull lessons from Fred Rogers and his work. Why is curiosity such an important piece for the way you all think about teaching and learning and education?
Yeah, so if you think back to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, we remember it as an educational television program, which it absolutely was. But Fred never focused, on fractions or spelling words in any of his almost 900 episodes. Instead, he focused so much on wonder, the things that he wondered about the world, the people he wondered about. He knew that curiosity was foundational. It is one of the most important of what he called his tools for learning. And you just listed a few of them: curiosity, creativity, connection, and more. Fred really picked up on the importance of curiosity from his mentor, who was a woman named Dr. Margaret McFarland. Now, Dr. McFarland worked with some of the most well-known child development experts on the planet. These were folks like Benjamin Spock and Erik Erikson. Dr. McFarland isn't as well known as some of those giants, but she is every bit as influential. She was a psychiatry professor at Pitt. She became Fred's lifelong friend and his mentor. So she consulted on almost every episode of The Neighborhood up until her death in the 1980s. And it was Margaret McFarland who taught Fred the Quaker philosophy, that attitudes are caught, not taught. She knew that curiosity was, in a very real sense, contagious. And we actually see this coming from the learning sciences today. And so if you pick any episode, almost any scene from almost 900 episodes in The Neighborhood, you'll find Fred doing a couple of things. You'll find him wondering about the world around him. You'll find him asking questions about things that interest him. And you'll find him singing songs like Did You Know? And a lyric from Did You Know is When You Wonder You're Learning. Fred knew that curiosity is the foundation for learning, that inquiry is the foundation for learning. And I think that that's part of the reason why we still have such fond memories of the neighborhood today, because we never knew quite what was going to happen. There were always new people we were meeting, new places we were going, but it was happening within the context of this safe neighborhood that Fred had built for us.
So when you say learning sciences, what is it that you're, I guess, referring to? Because I work a lot in this space and talk about the science of learning, which is, sort of backwards here. And there's some definite camps or tribes or different perspectives in the way that people, I guess, think and talk and say what is valuable. I mean, I get into conversations and one might say conversations is too nice a term with people that say, direct instruction versus inquiry, and that inquiry, learning and teaching, which is obviously much more, sort of synonymous with what you're talking about here in this sense of wonder and that kind of thing, that direct and explicit instruction is super important and the most effective way to help kids, build knowledge, and that inquiry, learning, and teaching is bad, and that the evidence shows that. I certainly have tried to unveil some complexity and nuance in that, but I'm curious, how do you think through some of those kinds of things? And when you say learning sciences, what are your, or maybe who are your sort of go-to scientists?
Well, when we say the learning sciences, we mean something so simple. Everything that we're learning about learning itself and how great learning happens, whether that's in an early learning center, in a school building, in a library, in a museum. Ryan mentioned earlier, one of our ahas in writing this book was reading papers that come from researchers at Carnegie Mellon University and University of Pittsburgh right in our own backyard, but also MIT and Stanford, and the set of researchers, particularly in higher education across this country, who have been studying and gathering evidence about how great learning happens. And what we try and do in our book, and ideally we're successful in this, is connect what it was that Fred did in more than 900 episodes of the program with the sciences and what the sciences tell us we need to be doing in terms of creating that atmosphere as Fred described. In so many ways, Drew, Fred was a learning scientist who was decades ahead of his time. And this is the evidence for that, because it was back in the 50s and 60s as Fred was deciding that he wanted to use the newfangled technology of television to minister to kids, as he described. And he wanted to do that because he saw how attractive television was to kids at that time. And he wondered how he might make it good and constructive and contribute to learning. It was at that moment that his teachers at the University of Pittsburgh and the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary said, well, Fred, you better learn something about child development theory and practice, right? Like any good educator would do, right? We think about pre-service training across this country and the world. And that's how Fred ended up at a place called the Arsenal Family and Children's Center, which is an organization in the East End of Pittsburgh that's still operating today. And here's the fascinating thing about that moment in time, because there was a happenstance, a Mount Rushmore of pediatricians and psychologists and psychiatrists who happened to be at that center at that time. There were folks like Benjamin Spock, the doctor who wrote Baby and Childcare, one of the best-selling books in American publishing history. There were folks like Erik Erikson, who I imagine many of the listeners here have studied as we think about identity development. There was also Margaret McFarland, who Ryan mentioned earlier. There are folks like pediatrician Brazelton and others coming through that space. So imagine that Fred is in this place and he's learning from all of these scientists and he's absorbing that. And then he ends up applying that science about what at that time constituted good child development theory and practice. And he applied it to puppetry and lyrics and a wardrobe and a physical set. He made it seem so seamless, but he integrated into every single program, and every aspect of that program was the science about how learning happens. And today's learning sciences and scientists are gathering that data. And lo and behold, it reflects what Fred was doing decades ago. He was a learning scientist ahead of his time.
Yeah, I'll give you one concrete example of this. So the title of the book, as you mentioned, is When You Wonder, You're Learning. And that comes from Did You Know, which was a song of Fred's that he wrote in 1979. And just take that phrase, when you wonder, you're learning. There's a research paper from the University of California at Davis that came out in 2014. That those scientists in that study found that when you're curious, your brain actually starts to take in information. They called it, it was like a vortex that sucks in what you're motivated to learn, but also everything around it. So in other words, when you wonder, you are learning. Your brain actually switches on. And we see this again and again. Fred doing something in the neighborhood, whether it's singing a song or using some technique in his scripting, that is now being not only validated, but mirrored in some of these studies that are coming out, in some cases a decade after Fred's death. He was just that far ahead of his time. And, we've had the opportunity to travel all over the country to talk about this book. And often we end up at universities or places of higher education. And it was just last year that we were at the University of San Diego. And when you walk into the Department of Education there, up on the walls are the names of, famous learning scientists, Maria Montessori, John Dewey, learning scientists, learning philosophers. I hope that our book is our contribution to someday get Fred Rogers up on those walls too, because that's exactly where he belongs. He is a giant of education in a way that he's not always given credit for. We remember him as being a nice guy in a sweater, which of course he was, but he was so much more than that. And there's so much we can continue to learn from him as educators and as parents.
And Ryan, that paper that you mentioned from the University of California about that vortex, about curiosity and wonder, written and published in 2014. Fred wrote the lyrics to "Did You Know You Wonder?" Did you know you're learning when you wonder in 1979?
Well, one of the things you mentioned there that actually spurred a question, and I'm not sure if you can even answer this. Maybe you all actually can give me examples of this, but you talk about how he recognized the power of television and leveraged that in a really amazing way. Amazing for a few reasons. One, in stark contrast to how we sort of see kids and people on screens now. And I'm wondering, again, maybe this is not a fair question. I'm wondering if you would hazard a guess, like how would Fred Rogers operate in the sort of TikTok culture? And maybe there you all have created TikToks.
Well, we would never pretend to speak for Fred Rogers. And to your question, I think we can, reasonably guess that he would have noticed and wondered about the things that were attractive to kids and said, how could we make this good and constructive? Whether it's a TikTok video or software to support AR or virtual reality, right? I think about some work right here in our region coming out of Carnegie Mellon University, working with early Head Start classrooms. And these researchers and the teachers in those early centers equipped kids with digital cameras, right? Something very attractive to kids. And so the kids were taking pictures of things that, maybe they noticed that during the day they were attracted to, like the blue fish in the aquarium. And then the kids were able to record an audio message. And then that visual and that audio message was sent via text to a parent, family, or caregiver. And to me, that's a beautiful example of a modern approach to what Fred did with that newfangled television. Because imagine that text that you receive as the parent or the caregiver, picking up that 4 or 5-year-old at the end of the day and saying, rather than saying like, what did you do today? As if a 4-year-old's going to answer that question, right? Being able to say, oh, I noticed that you saw that blue fish in the aquarium. That's incredible. What did you notice? Why did you take a picture of that fish versus the other fish or the other things that were in your classroom space? That's an example meant to illustrate that I think Fred would have been noticing all of the types of things that are around kids, whether it's robots or devices or hardware and software, and challenging us to say, the things that are attractive to kids, how do we make them good and constructive to support learning?
Well, one of the pushbacks that I can imagine, and I hear, and I think is certainly a valid pushback because, again, you're preaching to the choir when we're activating curiosity and inquiry. I've written about it, talked about it. I have a blog piece. It's about why capturing students' imagination is really key and central. To me, that's again sort of synonymous with some of the things you're talking about. But there's a danger in this kind of really heavy lean into sort of curiosity and wondering in academic settings where there are certain things you want students to learn, right? And I can tell you, when we work with teachers and inquiry and curiosity being a big piece of that, we say, well, there might be some situations, and there certainly are. And Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, I think, is a good example of this. Like, he certainly had some things some lessons he was trying to sort of convey and teach, but he wasn't being held accountable by state tests, right? So there's a bit of a tension there, insofar as we want to think about not designing and developing and implementing teaching and learning in ways that get us to, we're at the end of the unit, let's see what amazing things the kids learned. Instead, there is, at least some in academic settings, need for, like, we need them to learn, how to add or multiply or read or those kinds of things, right? And you go up and towards the high school levels, it becomes more specific and more complex. But how do you think about that tension of, like, okay, we want to capture the imagination, we want the students to be wondering, we want them to be curious, and we want to leverage that, but not at the expense of a fairly clear cognitive path that we want them to travel on that can sometimes get lost in that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Fred didn't teach content in the way that classroom teachers are expected to. There's that phrase that's often attributed to Fred, can you say neighbor, or can you say hero? Fred never even said that. He never even helped kids with things like as simple as pronunciation. He saw himself, he used to say, as providing the tools for learning. And we mentioned that earlier: curiosity, creativity, communication. And in many ways, he saw those tools as the foundation for then going on to learn content. He said, I would rather give children the tools for learning. If we give them the tools, then they'll want to learn the facts. And more importantly, they'll use the facts to build and not destroy. So I think Fred understood that content is essential, but that content in and of itself is not sufficient. He knew you needed any academic learning had to be paired with a nurturing of what's best in us. He knew that one without the other was insufficient. We see all sorts of modern examples of this playing out. One of the things we write about in the book was a few years back, Google was trying to figure out who makes a good boss. And for a long time, Google was just putting their top programmers in charge, which sort of makes sense in theory, right? Like, the best computer programmers ought to be making the decisions simply because they know the most stuff. Now, Google, being Google, decided to test this process. There's something they called Project Oxygen. And so they analyzed tens of thousands of data points, things like performance evaluations and exit interviews and employee surveys. And what they found was that actually content, it does matter. They came up with a list of 10 top things that successful managers needed. And you absolutely had to be a good coder to succeed at Google. But on that list of 10 things that mattered, content ranked almost last. The people who did well at Google had all these Fred-like qualities. They were good listeners. They cared about their fellow employees and their well-being. They could work on and lead diverse teams. They had these qualities that Fred had taught in the neighborhood, and they had the content. It is tricky to do both, but you need both in order to raise creative, curious, caring kids, in order to raise kids who can be successful at Google or wherever it is that they go on to work. And also, I think these tools give kids the opportunities to discover themselves, to figure themselves out, what it is that moves them and what bothers them, and ultimately what brings them joy. So it's a long way of saying that, yes, content absolutely matters. And I don't think even Fred himself would disagree with that. But kids learn content when they have these other tools for learning, when they're wondering about the content, when they're given an opportunity to be creative, and when they're learning that content from people who care about them, and vice versa.
So again, one of the other chapters that I thought was interesting is, I think it's chapter 6, Appreciation is a Holy Thing, and the subtitle there is Working Together. Something that, as you even note in the chapter, talk about a fractured society, and we talk quite a bit about that here in the podcast in certain episodes, the sort of tribalism and partisanship and polarization and the ways in which people don't seem to actually wonder about other people's perspectives. They want to prove that they're right and the others are wrong, and some versions of that. So I guess what's because it's more than that in this chapter. What's the elevator pitch for this chapter, and especially about working together?
It's interesting that you brought that up. We do have this sort of snap impulse, especially fueled by social media, to prove ourselves right. And maybe to make the people we disagree with look a little foolish in the process, because it can sometimes feel good to do that. What we found, and what, management experts have been finding, what academics have been finding, and what Fred knew all along, is that what makes a team, and when I say team, I mean teams in a classroom, teams in the workplace, a whole community, a neighborhood. What makes a team function is actually psychological safety. And psychological safety is the idea that I can show up to this team, wherever it is, whoever it happens to constitute, and I can disagree with you. And I can believe different things. And I could be the one person out of 10 that doesn't believe what the rest of the group thinks. And yet, that team respects me enough to allow me to have that belief. That team respects me enough to be able to have a conversation about that belief without attacking me as a person. And it's actually been found, there's all sorts of data now about how important psychological safety actually is. I'll go back to Google just for a second, because they've made some of this stuff public. Google found that teams where members felt psychologically safe, that is, where they could disagree with the herd, where there was a little bit less tribalism, those teams exceeded their sales goals by 20%, whereas teams that lacked psychological safety missed their sales goals by almost the same amount. And we actually see data from classrooms too, where kids feel safe, where they feel accepted by their peers and their teachers for the whole selves, where they don't have to fake their beliefs, they don't have to say what they think everybody needs to hear. Those kids do upwards of 20% better on standardized tests. So when we talk about appreciating our neighbor, we don't mean telling them that everything they think or do is great. We don't mean avoiding conflict, because psychological safety actually enables helpful conflict, enables healthy conflict. It only means that regardless of what we look like, regardless of what we believe, regardless of who we love, whatever, we don't reject each other's humanity. Right? We appreciate each other as human beings. Fred used to put it very simply. He said, I like you just the way you are. And again, that doesn't mean that we say we're perfect. Doesn't mean that every belief is okay. It only means that we're not going to consider each other unworthy of the neighborhood we all share because of our beliefs or our appearance.
I was having a conversation with somebody, and this actually now is resonating and would seem to certainly resonate with Mr. Rogers and the sort of ethos that we would associate with the show. But we were talking about how do we find common ground, with these sort of conflicts and find that shared humanity. And the idea was offered that if we leaned into like a sense, everybody deserves kindness, because one of the things that was rejected is that not everybody believes that we all have or should have the same rights. I'm not sure if I agree with that or not, but that was the sort of idea on offer. And I said, well, what maybe a better way to think about that, or a better pursuit that could find more common ground? And the idea was we all deserve kindness. And I'm wondering if that resonates with you all, or if there's, compassion is another word. I don't know if you all have a better word or anything to sort of expound on that with.
It's connection. One of the unexpected things for me and Ryan as we travel around this country and we have the opportunity to share, as we describe Mr. Rogers' blueprints for learning, is that time and again, we've heard either from educators or from entire faculties or school boards, this book was healing, which isn't something that, we didn't anticipate. That's not how we approach this work. And as we look at Mr. Rogers and the neighborhood that he created, we can see the healing aspect of what it was that he did. You could imagine we have, I don't know if you would describe it as an opportunity or misfortune, but to me, a lot of fractured communities and completely fractured school boards where folks have fallen into the trap of left and right and seeing everything as red and blue. And they've taken this book and they're commonly emotionally grounded and emotionally connected to a common story because so many of us shared that experience of watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And then they begin to say, what's fair for kids, right? What are expectations that we should expect from one another? Fred described to a journalist one time his television show as an atmosphere. Well, for a school board or a fractured school community or a fractured teaching core, when we start to say, what's the atmosphere that we want for ourselves and for our kids, and you start to articulate that, and you're grounded in that emotional connection of Fred Rogers, you start to turn to things like, well, it's fair for us to respect one another. It is fair and appropriate for us to be kind to one another. It is fair and appropriate for us to create environments that are joyful, that are connected to wonder and curiosity. There's an incredible grounding in the work of the neighborhood that is needed now more than ever.
And I would just add a favorite quote of mine from Fred's. He used to say that I think people don't change very much when all they have is a finger pointed at them. People only change in relation to someone who loves them. I think that's true. And I also think it's much more difficult to love your neighbor than it is to point a finger in their face, especially if you disagree with them. But as Gregg mentioned, we've seen it time and time again when people make the effort to disagree with each other, but to disagree with each other from the perspective of, I might not like what you think, but I recognize you as a fellow human, as someone who has needs and wants and desires just like me. It's really the only way you can have that healthy conflict, that sort of productive conversation that so many communities feel like they're lacking right now.
Is there a set of sort of norms and expectations that you all either use or Fred Rogers might have used or suggested, or organizations that you're involved with that might help, I guess, whether it's school board meetings or faculty meetings or in the teacher's lounge or even in classrooms, to be able to have some of these conversations that you and I, what we're talking about here, where we do find that shared humanity and we do have that respect. I'm hearing examples of, and I think it's both left and right, of people saying, we're not going to hear that opinion, we're not going to platform that, we're not going to allow people to say these things because it's harmful, it's hurtful. And that concerns me from a free speech perspective, which it certainly is an underlying foundational principle of our democracy. And so how do we get that culture? Because free speech can be legislated, but it doesn't matter unless we have that culture. So what are the things that you say we have to use these as sort of norms and expectations, if you have a list of them, to sort of foster those kinds of cultures?
We quote Fred Rogers often, as you might imagine, and among the things that Fred said is that each of us longs to know that we're loved and capable of loving. So if we can agree on that is an expectation for ourselves and for one another, that another lesson we can learn from Fred Rogers is his deep attention to noticing and wondering, but then speaking lovingly. And Ryan, I'm going to turn to you because I think you're so articulate about the ways that Fred Rogers, in a deliberate and slow way, taught us the lessons of listening deeply and speaking lovingly.
Yeah, so deep listening and loving speech is actually a concept we borrow from Thich Nhat Hanh. So you might be familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh. He was a Buddhist monk and philosopher. He died just last year. I think he was about 95. But he talks about effective communication as consisting of deep listening and loving speech. Now, deep listening basically does one particular thing. It acknowledges and respects the feelings of another person, even if we don't agree with those feelings, which is way easier to say than it is to do, especially when you're talking with kids, right? Because kids and adults sometimes have feelings that just don't make sense to us. But when we listen to those feelings, at least at first, uncritically, that is, like, without judging them, without sort of getting our rebuttal in, or even wedging in our well-intentioned words of wisdom, we start to do what Fred did, which is make those big feelings at least mentionable. And Fred liked to say that anything that's mentionable then becomes more manageable. And when we talk about loving speech does three things. It encourages, enriches, and empowers human relationships. And there actually is a great tool, a great framework for thinking about loving speech. And it was created by the Fred Rogers Institute, which is where Fred's archive is. It's located in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. The framework is called Simple Interactions, and it's available out there for free at simpleinteractions.org. And basically what this is a framework for thinking about the ways in which we're engaging with one another, the ways in which we're speaking to one another, and whether those interactions are conveying a sense of inclusion, whether those interactions are conveying a sense of respect, and whether those interactions are conveying the sorts of love and support that allow us to have those healthy conversations, even over contentious topics. So if your listeners are looking for a tool to help them have some of those difficult conversations, I would highly suggest Simple Interactions. Absolutely.
Well, you're reminding me of my mom, who was a teacher, and when she was teaching, she had a sign on her desk that were, 5 letters, YALAC, and she would say it, Yalak. You are lovable and capable.
I love that.
Yeah.
So it's definitely resonating with me, and I think the first time I've mentioned that on our podcast. But I think that's probably maybe a good stopping point here. But I wanted to obviously give you an opportunity to share any links and resources, and if there's anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention, definitely let's get those things out there as well.
Well, the great news about the work of Fred Rogers is that he wasn't a saint, right? Like, he was a human being just like you, me, Ryan, and anyone listening to this.
That's hard to imagine.
Well, that's the thing. But that's the thing. And Joanne Rogers, Mrs. Rogers herself, when we called her and said, Joanne, we're thinking about doing this book project, what do you think? One of the first things she said to us was, don't present Fred as a saint. He wasn't a saint. He got mad. He got angry. He was a human being like you and me. And as we think about the legacy of Fred Rogers, and we have our own personal, typically warm, good feelings about Mr. Rogers, we can put him in the category of a saint. But the reality is he was just like you and me. And he left blueprints for us about how we create great atmospheres for learning. Atmospheres that encourage curiosity, protect creativity, encourage loving speech, do the sorts of things that then lets learning happen in extraordinary ways. And further, as we think about Fred, it's the little deliberate, intentional things that we can do every single day, whether it's in our kitchen or in our classrooms or our libraries or any place that kids might learn. And so as we think about applying the Fred method, that connects all that we're learning about learning itself to the social, academic, cognitive growth that we know every kid needs and deserves, there are little Fred-like things in our own ways that we can do every day, inspired by that warmth and love that Fred helped us to feel. And we'd love to hear from folks around the country about the Fred-like things they might be doing in their schools, at home, in their own neighborhoods, at whenyouwonder.org. We'd love to hear from people around the country about the things that they're doing to create better atmospheres of learning for our kids.
Okay. Ryan, anything you want to add to that?
No, I would just say, the most gratifying part of this whole multi-year journey now is the teachers we've met. And the way this book has taken off among educators has been one of the most humbling experiences, probably both of our lives. And we spend a good amount of our lives now talking to teachers at schools, at faculty meetings, at sort of district kickoffs, at PD events. And to see teachers, running their own book studies and doing their own Fred-like projects is just so much fun. So I just echo what Gregg says. Please reach out to us. You can contact us at whenyouwonderbook@gmail.com. You can find us on social media at whenyouwonder. We love to hear from teachers, and we love to share your ideas. So if there are Fred-like things you're doing in your classroom or your school, there are so many people who could benefit from that. So please share it. Please reach out. We'd love to talk to you.
Okay, and the book, again, is When You Wonder You're Learning. I assume it's available on Amazon and all of the places where people get their finest books and things like that.
Exactly.
We'll put the link to wonder.org?
That's right.
Wonder.org and the When You Wonder book at gmail.com. So, Ryan, Gregg, thanks for the time. And as always, I hope folks find this conversation helpful.
Drew, thank you.
Yeah, Alec, Drew, thank you.